Thank you very much for joining us. This is our second ZSL Science and Conservation event of our 2024-25 programme. And it's great to see a different mix of participants coming from ZSL fellows, from the private sector, financiers, businesses. So hopefully you will be able to give some challenging and interesting questions to our panel speakers as well. So the focus of the event today is on tackling deforestation in the supply chain, looking at some regulation that's going to be coming in from the EU side, hopefully, but a little bit delayed compared to where we thought we would be at this point a few weeks ago. And looking at how can we apply scientific methods and conservation approaches to actually tackle global deforestation in supply chains. So we've got a great panel amassed for you tonight, focusing on traceability, focusing on satellite monitoring, and how can we actually provide some of the solutions to tackling deforestation in the supply chain and support businesses on that journey. Why is ZSL focusing on deforestation? Why have we got this in our conservation and science program for today? I think the main thing to be aware of is ZSL's been working on deforestation for over 10 years. We look at this as part of our wider mandate to try to implement and work towards a world where wildlife thrives. So we don't just do that through species-focused interventions, but we also look at entire ecosystems. And deforestation being driven by commodity production and agriculture is a huge component of that. We know that 420 million hectares of forest has been lost between 1990 and 2020, and that was about 10% of the world's forest at that time. And every year, we're still losing 10 million hectares of forest a year. 90% of that is caused by agricultural commodity expansion. So whether we're thinking about palm oil, soy, cocoa, coffee, natural rubber production, as well as timber and pulp and paper supply chains. So deforestation is embedded in every supply chain, in our homes, in our work, and it's a global phenomenon. It also causes 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Forests harbour 80% of the terrestrial biodiversity left on Earth, and forest provides livelihoods for over 2 million people globally. So tackling this is not just a biodiversity issue, it's a social issue and a climate issue for all of us wherever we are in the world. And although it's not just a problem for developed countries, we have a huge impact in terms of being the buyers of a lot of these commodity supply chains. And what we've seen over the past few years, the past 10, 15 years really, is buyer markets like the UK, the EU, the US, and other countries trying to tackle their role in global commodity production. So the EU has started to implement an approach to this called the EU Deforestation Regulation. And there are plans to implement a due diligence regulation on companies placing imported products on the EU market, as well as timber and other products that are produced within the EU. The reason that the EU is taking this approach because they calculated that a third of global traded agricultural products associated with deforestation are actually finding their way into the EU market. And that constituted around about 10% of worldwide deforestation footprint. So the EU or the UK, the US, acting alone is not going to eliminate deforestation, but it's an important part of the puzzle. And hopefully regulated markets starting that process and making their own regulations is going to encourage others to follow the same approach. Now, what does that mean in practice? That means that if you're a company importing a product to the EU, you will now have to implement due diligence, research on your supply chains to know where are those products from, how are they traded, and how are they finding their way into the EU, and to satisfy yourself that those products are not causing deforestation and they haven't been harvested, transported and traded illegally. So that will require a hell of a lot of information gathering on your buyers, where those products originate from, satisfying yourself that you understand the legal requirements in those countries, that you can conduct satellite monitoring, that you understand the supply chain structures, and that the product that you're actually buying is from where you think it's from, that your documentation provided from your suppliers actually applies to the product that's coming into your shop floor. And for the private sector, that's incredibly challenging a lot of the time, because those companies are not satellite monitoring experts. They're not legal compliance experts. They may have never had to think of this before. And especially in large international companies that may be sourcing from multiple different countries all around the world, knowing what is the law, the forest law in Cameroon is the first step before you can even say whether you are compliant with that forest law. So it's a huge challenge for the business sector. There is a responsibility for supply chain companies to adhere to this regulation and to other regulations coming in. But it's also a huge challenge. So that's why I'm really happy that our panel tonight is working at this interface between science and business practice, providing solutions to how can companies actually try to tackle these issues, and how can enforcement authorities that are implementing these types of regulations actually gain the knowledge, understanding and tools to regulate companies and to tackle deforestation. So we're going to have 10-minute panel sessions where each of the panelists will give you a presentation on a particular subject that they are expert in, and then we're going to have about 45 minutes of question and answer afterwards where you can really interrogate them, and please do interrogate them because they're all looking terrified at the moment, which I love. First up, we've got Dr. Antje Ahrends from the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh, who is Head of Genetics and Conservation, and she'll be presenting on developing new satellite monitoring techniques for monitoring deforestation caused by natural rubber. We've then got Jade Saunders, who's the Executive Director of World Forest ID, who's going to be presenting science-based traceability for deforestation due diligence, so looking at chemical testing techniques to identify traceability and origin of products. And then we've got Dr. Julian Oram, Senior Director at Mighty Earth, who is looking at Mighty Earth's rapid response and early warning system for commodity-linked deforestation. So all looking at some of the nitty-gritty issues on how do you trace products back to origin, how do you verify where those products are from, that companies are going to have to deal with. First up, Antje from Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh is going to start us off. She's got a background in landscape ecology and has worked for several years in conservation NGOs before moving into academia, where she worked on forest resource assessments on the ground in East Africa. And she now coordinates a program of work on science and conservation projects, including in the rubber sector, and has over 15 years of experience working on this topic. So, Antje, I'm going to hand over to you first to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Oliver, and it's a huge pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So satellite monitoring techniques for rubber. And as Oliver said, over 90% of tropical deforestation is thought to be driven by the expansion of agricultural commodities. And that's why it's really important to undertake due diligence and to have these legally binding trade regulations coming in, such as EUDR. I think at the same time, it's important to recognize that undertaking due diligence in the tropical agricultural sector is far from trivial, and there are still several challenges and gaps, I think, that require support and clarification from both science and policy. The first challenge is that there are still significant discrepancies in global maps of natural forests. So here in red, you see the discrepancies between 3 maps that have recently been released for for global forests. And these discrepancies arise because, particularly in these complex tropical agricultural landscapes, it's very challenging to separate tree crops, from natural forests. And that brings me to the second challenge, which is that for the majority of agricultural commodities, there are insufficient maps, meaning that the now mandatory mapping of production areas has to be done on the ground with limited support from satellite-derived maps. And in the case of commodities produced by millions of smallholders, this is no small task. And the vast majority of tropical agricultural commodities have at least some element of smallholder production. So that increases the challenges around mapping and traceability. And it also means that you have some very vulnerable supply chain actors whose entire livelihoods may in part depend on these commodities. In rubber, these challenges compound. Contrary to synthetic rubber, which is produced from fossil hydrocarbons, natural rubber is a renewable resource that is produced mainly from the tree, Hevea brasiliensis, and it has limited substitutability with synthetic rubber products. So natural rubber is actually a critical raw material that is still used in the production of over 1 billion tires annually and thousands of other products. Remarkably, the majority of global rubber is produced by smallholders, but there is now also an increasing element of industrial production. Tapping rubber is harder than it looks. We have tried. It involves making a very shallow and very precise incision into the tree to induce latex flow. And the latex is then collected in little cups. That incision is made in the early morning hours. Trees are usually tapped every second day, and every tree produces around 50 grams of rubber per tapping. Natural rubber is very versatile and hence sold in many different forms. Liquid latex, for example, is used in the production of gloves and condoms, and also in cold seals. So unknown to many, every crisp package and chocolate wrapper usually contains a tiny strip of latex. Dried rubber accounts for the majority of globally produced rubber. It's sold in many different grades, mainly used by the automotive industry, with some 70% of globally produced rubber going into tires. Coming to the challenges, maps for rubber production are still largely lacking. Rubber is straightforward to tell apart on the ground from forest, as you can see here. So there's rubber in the red ellipse and forest in the green ellipse. But on satellite imagery, it's really not trivial to tell the two apart. So you see rubber on one side of the river and forest on the other, and using standard vegetation indices, one cannot see a difference. That's essentially because one is trying to tell apart one dense assemblage of trees from another. Rubber has one specific characteristic, though, which is that it loses the leaves in a predictable window in the dry season. And as you can see, it does so very, very rapidly, followed by rapid refoliation. And that is indeed something that can be seen on satellite images. So on the second image composite on the right, you see that brief period during which the rubber plantation has lost the leaves, and the deciduous forest opposed of it goes through much longer phase of deciduousness, losing leaves and gaining them again. So using this characteristic, we were able to produce a first map of rubber for Southeast Asia last year, and we're now updating that map together with our partners. It's worth flagging that these maps cannot be expected to be perfect, and to illustrate that point, I'd like you to see an area where the rubber mapping could actually be expected to work almost perfectly, South Guatemala. Here you have plantations that experience a clear-cut dry season that is highly predictable. There are numerous cloud-free images, and the plantations are managed in a highly uniform way. On the right, you see the phenology of rubber as it's captured by satellite imagery, time series of satellite imagery. And you can see that beautiful regular pattern of rapid defoliation followed by rapid refoliation. Looks almost like a heartbeat. And here you see that same type of data for Cameroon. So there is still a phenological response enabling rubber detection, but the time series is already a lot more noisy, and that is mainly caused by cloud cover, and also some variation is caused by the use of different clones and plantation ages. And here you see that same type of data for Indonesia. So to a remote sensor, this looks awful. The time series is very sparse, it's very noisy. The plantations don't experience a predictable nor a clear-cut dry season, so they're not forced into that regular pattern. And also rubber is is planted by over 1 million smallholders, so it's planted and managed in highly variable ways. Needless to point out that our map really has largest uncertainty for Indonesia. Of course, over time, the maps can be expected to get better and better as we have more data and also better satellite data. And ourselves and other groups around the world are working actively on improving maps for rubber and other tree commodities. And in a few weeks from now, we'll be able to release an updated rubber map that is based on 3 times the amount of data than we had before. And just to show you where I think there may be the use case of the work that we and other scientists are doing, here you see polygons that a rubber farmer has mapped on the ground. So they are his rubber plantations. And overlaid on this, you see the forest map that has currently been released by the EU as part of the due diligence toolkit that is provided to companies. And not because that map is bad, but because it's just so hard to tell rubber and forest apart. There's a lot of conflation of rubber with natural forest in that map, actually several million hectares probably. So this now means that an operator who's importing rubber from these smallholders has to check manually tens of thousands of polygons because they're required to verify the accuracy of the information. And currently it looks as if that would be forest. So we hope that our rubber map can help to essentially reduce these conflations. They were reducing the burden on companies, particularly the companies who are sourcing from lots of smallholders, and also allowing them to focus on the areas where there may be a genuine mismapping or a genuine deforestation concern. And it is important to say, though, that clear limitations need to be kept in mind. Satellite-based maps for rubber can never be perfect, and some areas are easier to map than other areas. Indonesia, for example, is a big problem. Tropical Africa is also harder. And another major challenge in rubber particular is traceability. So there's some progress, for example, in the form of smallholder cooperatives rolling out traceability apps to farmers. But with 6 million smallholders, most of whom are not organized in cooperatives, it is worth recognizing the size of that challenge. And in smallholder supply chains, there can be up to 6 aggregation stages between the rubber being farmed and the rubber then hitting the processing facility and the books for the first time. And these aggregation stages are essentially people coming by on bicycles and collecting the rubber. And these supply chains can change on a daily basis because rubbers would sell naturally to the highest bidder. So they're not fixed. You haven't got those supply chains once you've mapped them once. Rubber is harvested almost every day of the year, and you have to trace this fully through almost every day of the year. In addition to which, once rubber is dry, it's often dried at the farm already. It's non-perishable, can travel long distances, and if it's latex, it requires fast processing, but you have a fluid that flows from bucket to bucket that is very hard to trace. So the complex smallholder supply chains, therefore, understandably seem very high risk to importers who in the regulation can face a fine of up to 4% of turnover in the case of flaunting. And rubber has a low profit margin, so 4% of turnover really is a steep fine, could be a business extinction event. And there is currently, it looks as if operators may be forced to marginalize these more risky smallholder supply chains. At least that is a threat that is often being spoken about. And I think it's worth taking that very seriously because the EU is essentially a very small producer, consumer of rubber in the 12 to 15% that the EU consumes in terms of globally produced rubber could easily be satisfied with industrial production alone. And industrial production has until recently been associated with some quite significant deforestation in some countries. But that type of rubber with its shorter supply chains may be preferable for importers. And there's also the issue of paper compliance versus actual compliance. For example, there may be significant unregistered border trade between Cambodia and Vietnam in rubber. And Cambodia really is a high-risk country when it comes to rubber deforestation, and that rubber may find its way into the EU with paperwork alone, just the digitization of records not addressing that problem. So to sum up, the due diligence and the legislation, I think, is very important, but it's also important to recognize that there are challenges and to speak openly about them and to have a close communication between companies, scientists, NGOs, and policymakers to ensure that these ambitious regulations really can achieve their aims. Thank you.
Thanks, Antje. That was fantastic and great to kick us off into the session of panels. I guess one quick question for you is you're developing these data sets for use by the private sector, enforcement authorities. We know that there are problems with the EU's own data set, so how are you getting it out into those audiences?
Well, so we're generating the maps and we're getting them out entirely free to anyone who would like to have them. We're sharing them in multiple ways. So we might be sharing them through the Global Forest Watch platform where they're easily accessible to non-technical audiences, as well as all of the code and all of the data on Google Earth Engine if people want to improve the maps, for example.
Great. So if you want to know where that all is, grab Antje after the session. And next up, we've got Jade. So Jade is going to talk to us about traceability through chemical means, so tackling a lot of the issues that Antje's mentioned here. How do you actually sort out traceability in a complex supply chain where it might be coming from 6 million plus smallholders? Jade is a 2024 Malago Fellow. She has formerly worked at the Chatham House Institute for over 20 years. And prior to joining World Forest ID as the executive director, she was a senior policy analyst at Forest Trend in Washington and actually helped to form the Timber Regulation Enforcement Exchange, bringing together enforcement authorities for the EU timber regulation, the precursor to the EU deforestation regulation. So, Jade, over to you.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and I love coming on after people have presented about satellite information because I think that the two sets of information, so the stuff that I'm going to talk about and the satellite imagery, are a really fantastic pair of tools that work very well together and in fact kind of don't entirely work apart, but I'll get into that in a minute. So I'm going to talk about science-based traceability, chemical traceability for the products that are being regulated. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background of how I ended up here, because I'm not a scientist. And you will know that, all of you that are scientists, when I get to the science slides, because they're going to be very superficial. But what I am is a policy person. I'm an anthropologist by training. I was a fellow at Chatham House as a policy analyst for 20 years, as Ollie said. And I started working on the version of this law that came into force in 2013. So there's the EU Deforestation Regulation. The thing that came before that, there was the EU Timber Regulation, and I started working on it when it was a policy concept in DFID in 2008. So I've seen this arc of like, we've got a problem, we don't have a law to solve that problem, we'll write a law, oh, there's a load of reasons that law didn't work, and now we're going to write the deforestation regulation. So it's, and I've ended up in this job because one of the main reasons that the law before didn't work was because it wasn't possible to get behind all of the pieces of paper in the system that say that every product floating around in trade is from a legal and sustainable source. It's very, very easy to buy products and then buy the paperwork that makes the products look good out there in the world. And so what I'm talking about is a way to cut through that, and what I believe actually probably the only way to cut through that that's on the table at the moment. So what's World Forest ID? We're a US-based non-profit, so that means we're a charity. So we don't work as a service provider to companies, but we do have companies that fund us, and we are creating data with their money, but it's data that goes into a pie, a data pie, where we have broad utility. So lots of different actors can access that data to achieve their aims, whether they're certification schemes, individual companies, or enforcement agencies. So I had a really fun conversation with the head of forestry at IKEA, who said, so you want me to give you funding to make data that might be used to take us to court? And I said, yes. And bless him, he did. So thank you, Mikhail. So we're a charity. Everything we do is for the public good. Our mission is to make forest-connected supply chains transparent with science. So we focus on creating data and tools to scrutinize these geolocation claims in forest-connected supply chains. And the reason that's so important is you can write a law that says you need to track everything back to individual plot level. You need to have every piece of paper to know where everything was. If the enforcement agents don't have a way of scrutinizing that information, it's meaningless. There are so many laws out there where people are required to do something where there's no real evidence or way of understanding whether they did it. You're just creating a massive bureaucratic beast, but without any real impact out in the world or any real kind of way to create downsides for companies that don't do the right thing. And so that's absolutely what we're focused on, creating the tools to cut through that. We create non-proprietary reference material. We use existing public data in innovative ways. We also work with Global Forest Watch, of course, and we work with enforcement agencies and government scientists to establish protocols and norms for the way this science can be used. A lot of this science is very mainstream in the food sector, and we've repurposed it for the timber sector, and then we're flipping it back to cover soy and cocoa and coffee. But it's establishing ways that different laboratories can kind of have protocols that allow them to all share data is really critical to what we do as well. So we're building out a global consortium of institutes to make sure that what we're doing is credible. Obviously, we're a non-profit. The vast majority of our staff are not scientists, so it's really important that we have these people who come together once a year. They will come together once a year as a scientific stewardship committee and oversee what we're doing. So they'll come together and scrutinize what we're doing and make sure that everything that we do is scientifically credible. So how does it work in practice, right? It's very easy to make all these big kind of claims about data and stuff, but what does it actually mean in practice? What it means in practice is that we send people out into forests and farms to collect physical samples. So they can be cores out of the base of a tree with an increment borer, probably with a drill bolted on the side because it's actually quite hard to get them out. Or it can be a cocoa pod or two, or it can be a handful of soy off a soy bush, tree. There you go. I'm an anthropologist. I do people. Whatever. Handful of soy. And we have an app. The barcodes. You take the sample. You put it in the pack. It has a barcode. You beep the barcode. That captures the timestamp and captures the GPS point. Then everything goes off to the laboratories. And these are the two scientific techniques that we're using mostly at the moment: trace element analysis and stabilized isotope analysis. And these things vary in the spatial range for plants and trees. And so what that means is an oak tree grown here and an oak tree grown here will have exactly the same DNA, but they'll have very slightly different chemistry. And that allows you to start to model a landscape, a reference landscape, with all of these different chemical values. There's about 4 or 5 stabilized isotope ratios. There can be up to 30, beyond 30 trace elements, depending what technique you use. And so the way, again, not a scientist, the way I think about this is, topography lines in a map. It's a two-dimensional map, but you can see what's a valley, what's a mountain. So you've got a topography line for each of these chemical values for your species of whatever that you're interested in a landscape. And once you've got that reference, you can you can take a product out of a shipping container or off of a retail shelf, run it for the same tests, or maybe somewhere in your production process, run it for the same tests, get the chemical values out of it, compare it with the reference data, and work out where it grew. Now, obviously, collecting reference data at scale is expensive. Developing these machine learning, AI, origin models is expensive. There isn't really, it's very hard to find the amount of money to work out whether that was possible at scale for an environmental cause, because people don't really care about the environment. But they do care about Russia. And so when Putin invaded Ukraine, I wrote a 2-page concept note that ended up on a desk in the cabinet office, and we got the money to create the origin model, the reference data necessary to identify Russian conflict timber in trade, which was wild, right? There are many things wrong with Boris Johnson. We've all read the books. We know it was, complicated times. But he believed in a moonshot, and this was one of his moonshots. And we actually did it. And this is the peer-reviewed paper for the model that we developed to identify Russian conflict timber in trade. This is the policy piece that we wrote explaining to policy people what that peer-reviewed science meant. And these are a couple of the cases that we've done with enforcement agents, and we're doing more cases. And what we're able to do is take birch, beech, oak, and pine out of shipping containers, companies are working with this, and enforcement agencies are working with this, and FSC, the biggest certification scheme for forests, working with this to take products out of trade and check whether the paperwork that claims an origin, or a sustainable or a legal origin area, harvest area, is actually credible. So we can get down to a few hundred kilometers. So this is not like the silver bullet that's going to tell you if there's logging, 20 meters outside the concession boundary or anything like that. But it can identify large areas of misrepresentation, fraud, chaos, whatever it is in your supply chain. And it is effectively working at the moment. What's interesting is that, and actually I was kind of surprised that there's no mention of the UK regulation here, that it's all about the EUDR. But actually, there is a UK version of this law as well, which was a commitment made in the Environment Act in 2021. And the commitment is in the primary legislation, and secondary legislation is being written at the moment. So the new minister has picked it up and is minded to be ambitious about it. So we might have a good new UK law as well. But when they started working on that law, I was brought in as an advisor to DEFRA to kind of unpack this history of what had worked and what hadn't worked. And one of the things that I said to them was, you need to invest in the science now. There's no point writing the law and then in 5 years you can't enforce the law and then you invest in the science. You need to invest in the science now, work out what's possible, and then you can write that into the secondary legislation and the guidance and all the rest of it. So we have this database, but we also have a soy database which covers about just over half of the Brazilian soy-producing states, Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina, I think maybe some in Ecuador as well, and a fairly broad cocoa database. So everything that we're doing with wood, we're also doing in partnership with Kew Gardens on what's known as the forest risk commodity side. We haven't got quite so far down the pipe towards it actually being used, but it's all motoring on that front too. And as I said, we don't just work with enforcement agencies, we also work with companies. So I think there are a few companies represented here, maybe people who work in companies. But if anyone as a company wants to get involved in any of the testing pilot activities that we've got, we're running this alliance with WWF to start to get companies to understand how to screen for the risk of misdeclaration of origin in their supply chains, what are the scientific questions they need to ask, what are the labs they can go to, and also how to react to a failed or whatever test. You know, if you get your tests back and they say good, bad, not so good, we don't understand, how to integrate that into your systems. So if anyone wants to get involved in that, they can. And the final slide is the thank you slide.
Great, thank you, Jade. I will always get excited about this kind of stuff because prior to coming to ZSL, I was trying to use a lot of this technology with UK retailers, and it was at the time where we just didn't have the reference libraries. So you just hit a brick wall where you knew the science was there, but you just didn't have a practical application. So I'm really happy that the UK and others are investing in it now and at least see the opportunities that it can present. Next up, we've got Julian. Julian is from Mighty Earth, an international non-profit organization that works on nature and securing a safe and stable climate. He's got 2 decades of experience working on agriculture and commodity supply chains. I've had the pleasure of working with Julian for the past few years, working with the natural rubber sector on driving up sustainability commitments in that sector. But Julian's got experience not only in rubber, but across oil palm, cashew, cocoa growing regions where he's worked in Ghana and different parts of the world. Prior to Mighty Earth, he also worked at Global Witness, Greenpeace International, Global Justice, and ActionAid. So Julian comes from a slightly different background, holding companies to account, and hopefully he can show the work that Mighty Earth is doing in that respect as well.
Thank you, Oliver. Thanks for inviting me. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to come to my presentation here. So what I'd like to do this evening is talk to you about a tool that Mighty Earth has developed in order to help engage with companies that are involved in commodity supply chains in a slightly different way from what we've heard so far. So hands up, I'm afraid that 2 out of 3 of your panelists, in fact, tonight are not dyed-in-the-wool scientists. I do have some science background, but I am, as Oliver said, mainly coming from a policy perspective and from a corporate engagement perspective. That's the work that I've been doing for many years and that we do at Mighty Earth. However, we do use, obviously, science and technology very heavily in our engagement with companies to show where we see risk of these companies buying products, buying commodities that are linked to deforestation. And by the way, we've been speaking about deforestation a lot. We have a slightly broader lens that we look at also other environmental problems arising from commodity production and also human rights issues and labor rights issues, which are also often linked to problematic, let's say, supply chains with some of these commodities. So I'm not going to spend too much long on the background to all this, but just to understand what we try to do with this rapid response tool that I'm going to talk you through. First of all, is to understand where deforestation risks exist in these commodity supply chains by using satellite imagery and sometimes complementing that with what we call ground truthing, you know, literally eyes on the ground, seeing what's being grown. Secondly, that we want to use the data that we derive from these analyses to engage with in conversations with companies and basically discourage them from sourcing from landscapes where there is active deforestation taking place or where deforestation has recently occurred. And then also to support regulatory efforts such as the EU deforestation regulation and ultimately the UK regulation that Jade was just referring to down the line. One of the things is that we also try to engage with companies to find alternatives and to take remedial actions as well, where they have been sourcing from landscapes where deforestation has already occurred. So this is my crude drawing of just the land area that is equivalent to what has been lost in terms of global forests since 1990. So in the 34 years since that time, that area of pretty much all of Europe has been lost in terms of forests. So that's the challenge that we're facing. And agriculture, as Oliver said in his opening remarks, is the main driver of that. We've already had the introduction to EUDR, just to reiterate that these are the 7 commodities which are covered, and therefore these our rapid response tool looks at specific commodities within this list. So how does it work? Okay, so basically the essential principles are as follows. This graphic, by the way, I stole from the internet. I just thought it's kind of cool because it kind of just gives you like a little insight into how satellite imagery is used at different resolutions to identify specific types of foliage, or trees basically, within various ranges. So that can be from down to 30 centimeters all the way up to more commonly 10, 20 meters. But basically with rapid response, what we try to do is first of all look at hotspots, like known areas where there is deforestation happening in commodity growing landscapes. And we know this through reports of partners. We work with other organizations that work in these landscapes, and so we kind of know where to look. But then more specifically, we use the high resolution satellite data to train our lens, so to speak, on very specific areas where we think that there is a particularly high risk of deforestation taking place. We look at also, therefore, the supply chain aspect of that, which is where are the collection points, processing points, factories, where the first point of purchase is often taken to for initial processing. Who do they belong to? We look at supply chain, we look at the ownership information, and then we start to layer on maps. So we look at the initial forest cover in those areas. We look at where the pixels have gone from green to brown, as Jade put it earlier, i.e. where there's been a conversion from natural forest to a commodity farm. And then also we need to kind of assess what that actually is, because unless we use very, very high resolution imagery, sometimes when you're talking about dense tropical forests and crops being grown under the canopy sometimes as well, that you don't necessarily know what you're looking at. You can see there's been some conversion, you're not entirely sure what it is. Antje mentioned that with rubber, there's various characteristics that help you identify that it's rubber. We do see similar different characteristics with cocoa, etc., but you're not necessarily sure, so sometimes we have to put boots on the ground to find out. And then, of course, we do the corporate engagement side, which is where we see that there's been deforestation happening in a specific landscape linked to a specific commodity around the first point of processing or collection of that commodity where they are buying from. We will then go to them and say, we think you need to investigate this. And then we'll have a dialogue with them where they'll usually go and they'll say, no, nothing to do with us, Gov, look the other way. But actually then we'll say, okay, well, prove it to us, right? Because we have this photographic evidence, we have the satellite evidence, and it's in your supply shed. So, and then we'll often engage with their customers as well, because these are usually big commodity traders, people that, companies that people haven't necessarily heard of, but they're supplying the likes of, Nestle and, Kellogg's and all these other companies that we do know. And so they have brand sensitivity, they have consumer sensitivity, so we obviously speak to them and say, you've got a problem. So that's the basic model. Basically, we use it in palm oil. Palm oil was our flagship kind of rapid response commodity. We use the MapHub's forest report as a kind of baseline for looking at where risk may be. We use RAD, which is a radar detected deforestation, at a 10-meter spatial resolution to look at where there's been recent forest disturbances, fires, clearances, etc. And then we layer that over the high carbon stock indicative map. Now, high carbon stock just means it's an area of forest, of natural vegetation, which is very rich in carbon and often very rich in biodiversity as well. We check, again, for the supply chain links. We look at the mills around there, and we look at who's owning those mills, who those mills supply to, etc. We use planet imagery, which is another satellite data imagery base to check the, kind of the change in the vegetation. We check the grievance logs of companies to see if there have been actually local complaints about deforestation or media complaints about deforestation in those areas. Pull the ownership data, supply chain data, send it to companies, and publish online. This is just some of the kind of legacy of that work. We've been doing it for 5 years. We've produced 43 of these reports, highlighting 725 cases of deforestation so far. That's led to 260-odd suppliers being suspended until those issues have been resolved. And you can see some of the brands, some of the companies that own those mills in one case here, and the brands that they sell to. In that sort of heart-shaped diagram, you can see where deforestation has taken place in the sort of northwestern corner of that concession area. We've recently started rolling this out with cattle as well in Brazil. This was our first case. All these lines are very confusing. They basically just show the movement of live cattle from farm to processor to slaughterhouse, sorry, from farm to slaughterhouse. And then we look at who the slaughterhouses supply. They often supply very big supermarkets in Europe, like Carrefour, et cetera. So then that gives us, again, a very strong tool for corporate engagement with those supermarkets and the retailers, as well as with the sourcing companies, the slaughterhouses, Marfrig, JBS, et cetera, in Brazil itself. Recently, we had a case in Brazil where our third cattle report highlighted a mass area, 10,000 hectares of Agent Orange from the Vietnam War being sprayed across one particular farm operation, actually covering 10 farms, but one owner, to deforest this huge area of land in the Pantanal, which is a very sensitive wetland, wooded wetland landscape in Brazil. Horrible stuff, really unbelievable stuff. And it was highlighted a lot in the media. Some of you may have seen that. Again, we roll it out with cocoa slightly differently. And basically here we're just looking for cooperatives that are buying cocoa in and around area where you can see the red dots overlaying the forest area. That's where there's been recent clearances. We look at the cooperatives that are around those areas because cocoa doesn't tend to move more than 15, 20 kilometers within that radius. And then we look at who's buying from those cooperatives and we do the ground truthing, et cetera. I've got 1 minute left. That should be fine. Again, this kind of shows you how we do it. The purple house-looking thing, that's the cooperative. The radius around that shows you where there's forest and where there's been recent fire alerts from the RAD alerts, et cetera. And then we go to the base map covers to see where forest has changed, in this case since 2020. And again, where we see there's been risk of where there's high risk of activity of deforestation, we approach the buyers. So, this is in the context of EUDR and the Environment Act, obviously. The reason why we think this tool is really helpful is because it helps companies to have it helps to encourage companies to develop better traceability, which the regulations require. Rapid response can also help them to identify landscapes and localities where they're particularly at risk. And also to focus on where they need to kind of put money and effort into to assist farmers and train them, et cetera. And then we can also use the rapid response to highlight areas of risk to enforcement authorities, and ultimately to be able to tell this story so that people know about it, there's greater awareness about it, and that the conversation we're having in this room tonight is known by a wider group of people. Oliver mentioned that there's going to be a delay to the EUDR. Perhaps it's not set in stone yet, but that's what the Commission wants. We put out that quote this week because we think that would be a real disaster. It sends all the wrong signals. And unfortunately, it actually caters to the companies that have done the least to prepare for this regulation and enables those that have done the least to, it penalizes those that have done the most and helps those that have done the least. So that's it from me. You can follow our work on those various social media channels and check out our website. And thanks for your attention.
Great, thanks Julian. And I'm now going to ask all the panelists if you would like to come join us on the stage. This is your opportunity to ask more. So what we do have is, by the power of technology, a Mentimeter link. So if you get your phones out with your QR scanners, you can submit a written question. We also should have a number of excellent helpers with mics. So if you don't want to use the Menti, stick your hand up and we will get a mic to you. Just wait until you get a... We've got one down here already now. Please just say your name and if you're affiliated with an organization or how you know ZSL, and then if it's directed to somebody who you'd like to answer.
Hello, My name is Saskia. I'm a volunteer at ZSL. My question is for either of you, really. This is heavily focusing on the EU. My question is, like, these suppliers, what can you do to prevent them from saying, well, you can go to hell, I'll go and sell my stuff elsewhere? Because the EU, in the grander scheme of things, is quite small globally.
Yeah, we'll maybe take a couple of questions and then we can ask the panel. So, gentleman at the front here and then the lady next.
Thank you. I'll start with a sort of a method question, I suppose. No one seemed to mention drone surveys, because there's obviously a great need to look under the canopy to distinguish at quite a fine level what's growing where, and clearly people on the ground are very expensive, but drones and sometimes LiDAR can match up, can make a difference in that area. So I just wondered what you thought.
Hello. I worked for a smaller company for a long time, and it was putting forward the FSC traceability for years, and buying a lot from China meant that we were doing a great job in the UK and Europe, but when it came to China, us as companies were having to train the Chinese factories what to do. So how do you have enforcement of all this good work adopted by responsible people in China? And for all their best intents, they were thinking they were, but they didn't actually know what boxes to check or what they were looking for.
Great. So, first question, what do you do if a company says what, so what?
The first and the last are the same question, right? Essentially, which is diversion. You know, what happens when it goes to China? What happens if it goes to and they don't know how to distinguish? So shall I take those two? Because I'm not going to take the LiDAR one. Yeah, I mean, essentially, there is always a choice that producers have to make, which is whether to raise their game, protect their resource, take a long-term view, and sell to a responsible market. That will pay a premium for it. Brackets question mark, will we pay a premium for it? Will we actually face the fact that we live off cheap resources that don't recognize the real cost of sustainable production, and step up and be willing to, you know, see food prices and commodity prices increase in our markets? That's unclear to me. But let's say that we're willing to put our money where our policy is. So yeah, the producers have a decision to make, or whether they take the short-term approach, liquidate the natural capital, and work out what comes next. I think it's really unclear, but the one thing I do know is that unless we are willing to pay that premium, they're not going to make the decision to do the harder thing and protect the resource for the longer term. And we have to work out ways to make that economically viable, particularly in the poor countries that we're seeing pictures of. You know, this is not a problem in Sweden, funnily enough, but it is a problem in Equatorial Guinea. It's, you know, money talks. And it's the same situation in China. It's like, yes, there's an education process. Yes, certification is a really important part of pushing those messages through supply chains. But you have to be willing to pay a premium. You have to be willing, the certification scheme has to be willing to say, actually, you don't get to use the certificate unless you understand what's going on in your supply chain, unless you can genuinely reach this threshold, which is why, you know, FSC was actually one of the founding organizations of World Forest ID for exactly this reason. They want to be able to use it in their integrity program, and I'm working with their integrity team at the moment to try and get samples out of their supply chain through different routes, some blind buying as well. So people doing your job now, you know, they may find that there's blind buying in their system, but much of it just auditors taking samples in the mills, in the processing points. And that information will be fed back round to the national program. So the FSC China will be informed by the integrity team if there are significant failed tests coming out of that work. But it's a technical exercise, but it's also winning hearts and minds as well. You have to go out there and say, we are actually doing this with integrity. That's the problem. You can't come to the table as hypocrites. It's like we're sitting here moaning about the delay to the EUDR. Nobody's asked when the secondary legislation on the secondary for the UK legislation is coming out.
We've asked a lot.
Yeah, you have. Yeah. But nobody here has. I reckon a few of you are letter writers. So if you fancy writing letters, the new minister on this in DEFRA is Mary Cray, and she's keen, but she needs a bit of a nudge. So do feel free to write letters.
Great. And then maybe if we tackle drones, Antje?
Not me.
Yeah, very
Julian?
happy to do that.
Thoughts?
So drones and LiDAR are fantastic data. In the case of rubber, we can't use it because we're covering an entire continent, and so we need data points that are sufficiently well dispersed throughout the continent. A drone essentially creates spatially highly clustered data. So from one drone flight, I might then end up with 3 or 4 data points, and I can collect them as well from high-resolution images or on the ground. But generally, I totally agree with you. These are fantastic data resources that really push the field in terms of being able to see what's under the canopy in some parts, or at least what does the canopy consist of. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I should have mentioned that we do use drones as part of our ground truthing. It's not just, it is boots on the ground, but it's boots on the ground sometimes launching a drone in the air, especially in very remote areas and areas which are hard to access. Because roads are poor, etc. So we do use drones to help verify, using it to gather imagery to help verify what exactly we're seeing. So yeah, that is part of what we do with rapid response. Just very quickly on the question about, kind of incentivization. I do think that Jade's absolutely right about the reward. There has to be some reward. I think also though it may be a time thing that we may see some industries where only the sort of, how should I put it, the industry leaders feel ready or willing to supply the EU market or the UK market where the expectations and the legal requirements are higher. But I think there will probably become, over time, a larger number of companies that are equipped to do that. And there's some industries where they just can't. So cocoa, for instance, like 30–40% of West African cocoa, 60% goes to the EU. They can't just find an alternative market in Saudi Arabia, whatever, overnight. It's not going to happen. So they're a bit more forced, if you like, to comply. Yeah.
Great. And then sticking with Julian, we've got a question on the Menti. How rapid is rapid response? And not only the detection, but how long does the whole process take from identifying deforestation occurrence to engaging the company, engaging the buyers, getting them to stop sourcing from an infringing supplier?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a great question because it doesn't have an easy answer. In that it kind of depends. It depends on the commodity, it depends on the geography, and it depends on the companies involved. So when I say the commodity, for instance, if you're burning an area of rainforest and then grazing cattle there within 6 months, that's pretty easy to detect and act very swiftly on. With cocoa, by the time you plant the cocoa until the cocoa comes onto market, and then and even can identify it as a cocoa plant, especially using satellite imagery, it can be several years, right? If we were to do it with rubber, rubber doesn't come on stream they don't start tapping rubber trees for about 7 years. So it really depends on the commodity in question. Annual crops and cattle is much quicker. And then in terms of the geography, in some areas, for instance, in Cameroon, they grow cocoa and to some extent rubber under the canopy. So it can be much harder, and it's much more dispersed. So you don't get these sort of blocks of sort of clearance where it's easy to detect. And therefore, the supply chains are a little bit more challenging to kind of get under the skin of, so to speak. Whereas in West Africa, it's much more clear-cut, unfortunately, and pardon the pun. And then when I say about the companies, well, that just has to do with how receptive and willing the companies are to engage, to listen, and to take action, depending on what you're presenting them with.
So, hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So what you've been describing are some fantastic tools and capabilities for identifying some of the issues. my question is, what are some of the hurdles to getting some of these substantiated concerns that you're identifying escalated up supply chains? And I'm thinking here about liability, right? So what are some of the issues to actually announcing and broadcasting some of the substantiated concerns that you're finding?
So, I mean, the challenge is, can you get data that you can pin to a corporate actor that is subject to a law that somebody actually wants to enforce, right? That's the piece. So you can find incredible problems in the supply base. You can go out, you can do surveys, find child labor, satellite imagery, LiDAR, all the things, right? But nobody is really, some countries are, but by and large, there's not a lot of enforcement going on the ground at that level. The challenge, the legal instruments sit in other jurisdictions, and that causes a kind of blunting effect of whatever that legal instrument is, because you're trying to connect this corporate actor who is subject to a particular law with these bad things over here, which is why the science stuff that I'm talking about, which is looking at a product that's landed in this jurisdiction, is the legal, is owned by the corporate actor who is responsible, who is has the kind of legal yoke on their back, but you can track it back, you can map it back to the reference data that's in the area where there's a problem, is so powerful. It's really, really hard both to write legislation that makes a legal requirement in one jurisdiction based on an illegality in another jurisdiction, but it's even harder to enforce it. Particularly, I mean, the European construct, I don't know, you sound like a lawyer, so I'm going to talk a little bit. Are you a lawyer? Nod if you're, oh, no, you're not, okay. But the European law, the way that the European law is structured is that companies have to have a system and they have to disclose some of the nuts and bolts of those systems to the regulator. And then the regulator can kind of look through it and see whether it's credible. For timber at least, there's an equivalent legal construct in the US called the Lacey Act, which is, it doesn't tell the companies what they need to do as a system, but it just says, don't bring illegally harvested wood into the US. Otherwise, we'll get, if we find it, we'll get you, kind of thing. Both of those legal constructs have different strengths and weaknesses, but essentially it's really, really hard to write a law and enforce it. In my estimation, there are 3 enforcement hooks in the EU deforestation regulation. Based on what I've worked out about the UK secondary legislation, I don't even know if there are 3. But anyway, one is the geolocation claim. So the companies have to say what plot or plots did this product grow on. The second one is a cutoff date for when that production land went from forest to farm. So the quote about when did the pixel on the satellite go from green to brown? And the third one is, was that conversion from green to brown legal? Now, legal frameworks in these countries are incredibly complicated, and most of the competent authorities in Europe have already said they won't check it because it's too hard. So that's one of your 3 hooks down. The second one is when did the pixel go from green to brown? It's very, very hard to do. You've seen the maps that Antje showed with different methodologies for satellite data showing different things. The European Observatory, which is the kind of European function to deliver satellite information, has said, don't take it into court, it's too glitchy. So in my estimation, the only way that you can really think that there might be actual liabilities on companies is to say your product didn't actually grow where you said it grew. And that's what we're trying to do with the chemistry, but it's hard.
No.
Pretty great answer.
We've got another question on smallholders. So we've mentioned 6 million smallholders in the rubber sector, millions of smallholders also producing cocoa, palm oil globally. So how do you protect smallholders and subsistence farmers when there's so much involved in proving sustainability claims, and how do you ensure that they don't get cut out of markets and they're ultimately the losers in all of this? So Antje, maybe views from the rubber sector?
Yeah. So I think that's a really important question, because it doesn't have an easy answer. But something I think that is incredibly important to do in this context is to talk to the importers, because they're the ones who sign off the due diligence statement. They're liable with 4% of their turnover. They take this massive risk. And so the exclusion of smallholders then stands or falls with the perception of risk that these operators may have, so the primary importers of the product into the European Union. And if they take the current law letter by letter, it actually looks extremely risky to source from smallholder supply chains. Forest is defined as an area that has a size of more than half a hectare. So that could be a smallholder converting a little bit of land to something else. I know that the competent authorities are talking to companies and are saying, look, this is not about going after smallholders. You don't need to worry about this. But it's not anywhere legally binding written down, as far as I know. So I think the EU has the opportunity to clarify questions that companies have in legally binding FAQ. And that could be an opportunity to provide some legally binding reassurance that smallholders do not need to be marginalized. And for that's why I think there really is a need to have an intensive dialogue with importers, rather than just saying, oh, but the importers, they have their own business interests and we shouldn't be talking to them. I think it's really important to talk to the people who sign off the due diligence declaration, because ultimately it's them deciding what's going to happen, and it's their perception of risk that decides what's happening.
Yeah, Jade?
May I?
Dad?
So this has been a really interesting few years, because I've never had so many massive corporates with massive profits telling me how worried they are about smallholder farmers. It's been extraordinary. They've been pushing down gate prices for all of these commodities for the last 20 years. The reason that smallholder farmers can't do this is because they haven't been given the income that they should have been given for the raw material. The vast majority of the value in the value chain does not end up at the production base. So let's just step back a little bit from the question and think about who's benefiting and who's losing. Of course, I don't want to see smallholder farmers shut out of supply chains, 100%. But I also find it really hard when you've got a corporate that's making massive profits telling me that they're worried about smallholder farmers not having the money or the capacity to map their lands. I'm like, okay, so pay them more. Pay for it. You're the ones massively benefiting from these supply chains. It's not those farmers. Those farmers, in many cases, are paid so little that they're employing their children. There's money in the supply chain. There might not be money in the farm, but there's money in the supply chain. And I think it's really important to think about that, as well as, in terms of where the responsibility lies for actually making it possible for the production base to generate the kind of information necessary for companies that make a lot of money out of these trades to be compliant with the law.
We've got a related question. So Julian, you might be about to answer this anyway, but what does, you've mentioned moving money to farmers for the mapping, geolocation requirements potentially, but what does a sustainable supply chain look like, and what else do we need to build into that to ensure that compliance with EUDR is there, but also we're getting beyond that and tackling livelihood issues, etc. So
I don't think we've got there yet, but I'm interested in how do you get beyond it, Julian?
Well, I know you got. I think first of all, just to echo what Jade was saying, that it's not just about the corporations having the capacity to help farmers with, giving them mobile phones and tools to map their farms and provide a support for them to get legal titles and all those things. As helpful as those things are, the most fundamental thing a company does with a farmer is buy their goods, right? So the most fundamental impact they can have is to pay a fair price. And as Jade was saying, she said 20 years, but we can go back a lot further than that if you want to see how long it's been since smallholders in most supply chains supplying tropical commodities to the EU and the UK and other OECD markets have been paid a fair price. So essentially, that is the number one thing that companies should do, is that they should recognize that there is a you know, people talk about a living income, a living wage. We talk about a living income because farmers are self-employed, so they don't earn an income, they don't earn a wage, but they do deserve a living income. And there's a big, you know, movement now in the cocoa industry for companies that buy cocoa to provide a living income. Oliver and I work in a forum that works on sustainable natural rubber. That's an issue that we're starting to push through that forum as well in the rubber industry, et cetera, et cetera. So that's of critical importance. The one other thing I would say, though, is that actually two quick things. One is that it can actually provide an opportunity for smallholders as well, the regulation, because for companies that know that farmers, you know, that do have associations where they know where everyone's farm is and they have the coordinates for that, they can be kind of welcomed into those supply chains in a way that maybe they weren't before. And the other thing to say, though, is that where the real risk lies is with really remote farmers, the ones near roads, the ones near collection centers and processing points. They're the ones that get the first attention when it comes to this sort of thing. And the ones that are, you know, a 7-hour, you know, motorcycle drive and then a 3-hour hike from the nearest road, they will suffer, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and that is exactly something that ZSL is working on. We have a regional office in Thailand. We're working with a group of smallholders that are 8 hours away from the nearest factory. So they get a truck coming around once a week. They're very much price takers because that's their only opportunity to sell. And they're going to be the first ones that are cut off because of proximity to factories. And also because it's not a massive rubber production region of the country. So why would you invest in that small area far flung from the main rubber production area? This is a very real concern for smallholder communities in different parts of the world. I think the other thing that you were mentioning there is actually regulation, what's coming in terms of the traceability requirements for sustainability purposes can also be leveraged for getting to living income. So if you have traceability back to a geolocation for where your rubber's harvested from, you're probably also going to know all of the actors in that supply chain. So that makes transferring that premium to the smallholder an easier conversation to have. You can utilize the traceability apps, the data that's coming up for compliance purposes for sustainability requirements to actually leverage change on income and livelihoods for smallholders, which I think is really exciting that we're getting to this level of transparency and traceability that's going to unleash a lot of the opportunities for smallholders. But as we say, whether that is in the interests of companies when it starts to come into the matter of paying more, that's where we get issues. Can I make one
controversial statement? Mm-hmm. This is not a Mighty Earth policy, by the way. This is Julian Oram speaking here.
Going rogue.
I don't always necessarily think it's a good idea for smallholders to be sucked into global supply chains in the first place. If there is the right supportive national policies for farmers to create local markets for their produce, in much the same way as we're encouraging farmers often to do in the UK now with, you know, reducing food miles and building local food networks and food webs and all these sorts of things. If you can strengthen linkages between farmers and consumers in their own countries, then they don't have to be reliant on the vagaries of the global market and whether rubber company A or cocoa company B decides to pay them a fair price or not, because they have a more sort of a closer foundational relationship with their consumer base. And so, you know, the idea that it's always bad that that smallholders will be not necessarily part of a global supply chain supplying whatever it is, you know, I think it's arguable whether that's always a bad thing. Just my own point of view.
More questions from the audience in the middle here. We'll take one. I'll see if there's any more, and then I'll come back to you, sir. One at the front here afterwards as well.
Yeah, I'm just asking this as someone that used to be a biodiversity consultant, but I'm curious whether you think corporate sustainability policy at the moment that it's in is a hospitable receiving environment, not just for the EUDR, but a mountain of voluntary guidance that's already required by large firms' investors for deforestation policy, as well as, I mean, a moment where corporate sustainability is in an adversarial position, proxy season for sustainability commitments has not gone well, and corporate sustainability teams are being laid off at some of the largest firms in the world. Does it feel like a good moment for firms to implement not just compliance guidance, but best practices that you've just demonstrated?
This is why we need laws, right? Because the voluntary market is only as good as the commitment to move on it. And what we've seen with voluntary commitments all over the place is that they haven't actually got to the nub of the problem. All of the UK food retailers in 2010 committed to removing their deforestation from their supply chains by 2020. Well,
how are we doing?
Yeah, exactly. And the reason it didn't happen was because of traceability. Ultimately, that was the stumbling block, because the corporates would come to the table, say, I want to buy the thing. Okay, now tell me where the thing's from. Like, I don't want to pay any extra for the thing, and I definitely don't want to pay for the data. It's just data. And of course, the trader on the other side, it's like the whole industry is set up to be ultimately efficient and therefore pretty opaque. I'm not going to sell you the thing at whatever the thing is, at market price, not charge you anything extra for that, and then give you the data, because I don't know where it comes from, because every point in the production is just maxed for efficiency. And you know, you've seen what's happened to the voluntary carbon market, the forest carbon market. It's not credible. People have just driven all of the value out of the system. So I think it's a completely different beast. This is not the sustainability people who come from the perspective of brand, reputation, all of that stuff. They're not the people we're talking to now. Once there's a law, you're talking to the compliance team, you're talking to the risk team, the lawyers. You can often you're in a situation where you're talking to the sustainability people and they're like, they'll go to the workshops, they might have 30 grand to do a pilot project, but they can't do anything that actually changes the way the company sources. And that is the bigger footprint. So the reason we have laws is because that whole bubble of stuff actually didn't deliver.
Hi, thank you guys. It's been really interesting. My question's around policy, so maybe directed at you, Jade. You said earlier on how, you know, if we need to put our money where our policy is, we need to start as consumers. And I think everyone in this room has seen that over the last couple of years. We've been told by fuel companies, by food companies, but Shell and BP have reported their record profits for the last few years. So has Tesco's. We're all paying more for that premium, and we're all really aware of greenwashing as well. And as you also highlighted, when you look at the cost to the consumer of a product, you break it down. A lot of it is in transport, levies, taxes, assembling the product, making it.
So much. I've got a brilliant stat. I will come and find you afterwards. I'm not putting it on record, but I will come and find you afterwards. No, absolutely. When I say we need to put our money where our mouth is, I don't mean the individual consumers. It's not possible for individual consumers to do this at scale. The certifications can't hold all of our best wishes. It's not, I don't mean like that. I mean, as a country, as a jurisdiction, as a market, as a bunch of regulated large corporates, there aren't that many big companies who ultimately are retailing this stuff in the end. Julian's very effective at identifying who's making the money out of these things. So I'm talking about at that level, not at the individual level. Although, yeah, I agree with you. It's very hard to take responsibility for these kinds of global problems as an individual consumer. It's not a realistic ask.
And maybe if not consumers, we hear a lot about companies saying they're getting investor pressure. How much are you taking your solutions to investors? Do you think that there is that pressure from investors and financiers of these global commodity markets?
Pressure for what? Pressure for plausible deniability?
I assume you mean pressure to get their investee companies to change their supply chain behaviors. Yeah. Sometimes not enough. And you know, things like EUDR, they don't apply to the finance industry directly. That was one of the battles that was fought by civil society that was campaigning on the regulation that wasn't won. I don't think the UK regulation will either, as far as I'm aware. And so they're kind of getting away scot-free. Now, there are some investors that like to do things, you know, in a more ethical way, but, you know, and there are funds that are obviously set up to do that. But I think by and large, the flow of money, the flow of finance into the agri-food industry is still financing largely bad stuff, let's just say. That's policy language, by the way.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? I think we've probably got maybe last question before we wrap up.
I'm holding everybody up from the Okay, thank you. Ray Heaton, ZSL Fellow. I didn't say before. What happens to all this stuff that's seized? All those tons of Russian timber that were in Belgium? And I'm going to indulge myself. Another question is, does fair trade type supply chain help in any of what we've been talking about?
Probably related questions, aren't they?
So I'm sorry, I got two in.
Yeah. What happens to the sea stuff? It completely depends on the jurisdiction. Some agencies have the power to, that are allowed to, or mandated to destroy. Some will auction. Some will, the Belgians actually ended up releasing it back to the company, or some of it, long, legal, gnarly story. So I think it's, yeah, it really depends. Obviously, sometimes it can cause real problems because it's really expensive to store this stuff, or it's terrible to destroy it. There's a kind of theoretical, like, oh, well, you could donate it to a charitable cause. But often, you know, you're talking about shipping containers full of commodities, and there's no charitable cause that really needs that much plywood, or whatever else. Thank you. Oxfam would be like, super. So yeah, it is really difficult. Actually, one of the most powerful, this is a super nerdy, like you will appreciate this, super nerdy policy nerd moment. It's actually much more powerful to create an economic injunction on the company so that they can't sell it on than it is to seize it. Because then they have to pay the cost. They have to pay the downside, the cost of destroying it or storing it or whatever else. So seizure is actually not a brilliant intervention. The Latvian case wasn't a seizure. In that case, the company was fined and there was a year-long economic sanction. So they weren't allowed to trade in the product for a year, which would have put them out of business because it's their main product. So it's, yeah, seizure's a difficult one.
Do you want to handle the fair trade one?
No. I'm tired now.
To what extent does fair... Antje, do you want to have a go at that one? Okay. I'll hand it over to Ollie then. Very quickly, I think to what extent does fair trade make a difference with these things? The standards via which fair trade operate are largely to do with things like living income and you know, the way in which farmers are able to earn a premium. There has been not enough attention, in my personal view, by fair trade on environmental issues in general and deforestation in particular. That's something that I think is starting to change, but needs to change, in my view, again, much more quickly in order for it to be an effective part of the solution. That's my summary answer to that.
Great. Well, we're going to wrap it up there. So thank you very much for all of your attention, participation, and excellent questions to the panel. If we can give the panel a round of applause. Do join us again on November the 12th for our next session, which is going to be on human-tiger conflict in Nepal. And keep your eyes and ears open for the rest of the program for 2024 and 2025, because we are going to be running a whole host of different sessions on different topics that will be equally appealing. As ever, please, please, please continue to engage with ZSL in every way that you can, whether that's through our science events, whether it's through supporting us as a corporate member, or whether it's just getting involved with us online through social media. That's it for the night. Thank you very much for joining us.